I would like to start by asking you about what has been something that you were not expecting, positively or negatively, about leadership as we face the current crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic.
There were some that asserted that what we've faced due to COVID required a fundamental change to the nature of leadership.
Okay, in what way?
And I push back on that assertion and say what is required of leadership or people exercising leadership hasn't changed, but the context most certainly has. And so when you think about what leaders are required to foster, I'm fond of pointing to the work of the Center for Creative Leadership that says leaders primarily are responsible for generating three outcomes: clear establishment of direction, clear alignment of people, and sustaining the motivation of the people within the organization. So direction, alignment, commitment. And so COVID didn't change any of those three outcomes. However, it did change how people went about ensuring those three outcomes were being fostered. So the nature of leadership hasn't changed, but the context has changed. I was surprised that there were people asserting that what it means to be a leader had changed. That surprised me that they were even putting forth that notion in the midst of the disruption. But I think it's important for people to understand leadership hasn't fundamentally been altered by what has gone on in the environment. However, the environment has most certainly made the challenge associated with leading more complex in many respects, but leading's still leading.
And it was complex already, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I
And
was
as
simply surprised by that people started to assert, well, maybe what it means to be a leader is fundamentally different as a result of the level of complexity. And for me, I always push back on that notion and say, no, context has changed, but the fundamentals are the same.
So, how would you describe then the core of leadership? You just mentioned direction, alignment, and commitment. But when you think about the leader itself or leadership, how would you describe the fundamental mission a leader has?
The fundamental mission for me is always around leveraging influence in service of fostering a desired outcome. Leadership is all about influence. Of all the definitions of leading that have ever been conceived, not one says must be in charge. But a
So,
meta-analysis reveals that it typically has five components or five elements. Two or more people engage in a process that's iterative in nature, that leverages influence in order to achieve a desired outcome. And so you strip it all away, and leadership is about influence in service of fostering the desired outcome. When you are in charge, you have certain power bases at your disposal that you can leverage as part of that influence process. Whether or not you're in charge, it's still about influence. And so for me, that's the essence, is how do you become more influential in service of increasing the likelihood that you can bring about the desired aim.
so do you think there's not really a need to have someone in charge? Why do you think it has been described this way?
It's not to say that it's not important to have someone in charge, because leadership and management are two sides of the same coin, and you need both in order to sustain an organization over time. Managers foster efficiency, and leaders ensure that you drive towards long-term effectiveness. And so you need competent managers to help shepherd the efficient utilization of organizational resources and time. And you need leaders to help foster the development of the people within the organization and underwriting the experiments that allow the organization to develop new capabilities. And so having someone in charge most certainly helps with the management piece, because that can direct that allocation of resources. Additionally, if you are in charge, it increases the likelihood that you have the wherewithal to underwrite those experiments that need to transpire. So when you have formal authority, what French and Raven called legitimate power, it most certainly can be very, very helpful. And so it is possible to have too many people in charge. It's never possible to have too many people leading well. And so there's a time and a place to say you're designated as the formal leader. But even when you designate somebody as being in charge, you shouldn't marginalize the ability of others to engage in that process of leading.
And you just mentioned there's a time and a place to lead. And actually, I recently published something related to the place in which leadership occurs. And I would like to ask you about, well, now with these fundamental changes that we are still facing in terms of place. So there are more remote workers than ever around the world. And now we also have these hybrid workforces that we need to manage. And there will be also some shifts in the future as everything starts to recover, and there are probably new ways to lead. So what are your views in this sense?
The structure of an organization must be reflective of the strategy the organization is desirous of executing. And so if your strategy is one that people can approach while providing greater flexibility to the workforce, I think people will want to seize that flexibility because it provides a variety of benefits for them. Mm-hmm. However, if your strategy is one whereby it cannot be enacted successfully, having a highly flexible work arrangement, then you're going to see friction. So there are already lots of folks saying, I've demonstrated my ability to do my job without having to come into the office all the time. Now that restrictions are being lifted, is it required that I come back to the office all the time? Or can we seek out something that's more flexible that affords me greater opportunity to address the varying competing demands I have on my time while still ensuring that I'm doing that which is necessary to make my organization successful? So this is going to be the challenge for a lot of companies. The fact that you were all physical in the past, you've now demonstrated the ability to be remote to some extent. Will you simply default to doing what you were doing before, or will you leverage the lessons learned over the past 15, 18 months in service to saying, yes, we have found that there's a way in which we can still be successful while creating a more flexible set of work arrangements that also can lower our cost structure. I mean, there's a lot of overhead associated with bringing everyone back to the office needlessly. But there are times where you need everyone there because certain things you're trying to do, we still have not been able to replicate using a remote model. So just, are you open to the prospect of behaving differently?
So there are interesting challenges ahead, I believe, and also from a human viewpoint, because of course we're discussing more what happens from the side of the organization. But when we think about leaders and how they connect humanely or how they address the needs of talent, what do you think we should consider?
We had a saying in the United States military of mission first, people always. So those who are put into formal leadership positions, their first obligation is always to ensure they're doing that which is necessary to accomplish the mission. However, they must always keep the needs of their people foremost in their minds, needs and interest. And so as we think about talent has a variety of interests. And if you want the best talent, well, then the best talent wants to know that they're going to be empowered to do things and to figure out the how. The best talent wants to know they're going to be adequately supported. And the best talent wants to know that the organization is going to serve as a vehicle for putting them in a position to win, if you would. And so I think the best talent has strongly shown that they will always keep the mission first in their minds, but they also want to ensure that they have the greatest amount of flexibility in terms of how they approach their work. And so organizations that will be very rigid relative to their competitors that are essentially pursuing the same aims, but providing their workforce a lot more flexibility, they will have an advantage over those that are more rigid in their approach. So if you want to get access to the best talent, you have to understand what that talent is looking for. And is there a way in which you can meet the talent's needs while also ensuring that you're meeting the organization's needs? Talent will not push back when they go, yes, what you're saying makes total sense, and I see no other way of going about it. Great talent will push back when they see there's another way in which that need can be met with a more flexible arrangement. And already we're seeing individuals start to make those choices because they look at two situations. They look at one, more rigid. They look at the other, more flexible. If in fact they say the benefits accrued from one versus the other are not that different, they'll choose the more flexible arrangement.
And you just mentioned your experience in the military. So I know while you were there, you had to face many, many different types of crises. In this sense, I would like to learn from your experience. And when you see now what's happening with COVID-19 and this pandemic that we're facing, what do you think we can apply from this experience you had in the past?
One is developing an appetite for accepting risk. Two is developing a greater tolerance for ambiguity. Three is fostering a learning orientation. And four is recognizing that mistakes will be made. It's not so much that you make mistakes, it's how you learn from them. All of those things people have had to deal with in COVID. Like, yes, we're going to have to take some risks. We're going to have to learn some new things. We're going to make some mistakes along the way, but we're also building our people up so that when they face similar scenarios in the future, they'll have a little more comfort with doing so. All of those things are things we used to work on routinely in the military. We spend a lot of time in the military running through a variety of scenarios, not because we're preparing for that exact scenario, but because we're building capacity in our people. We're helping them to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. We're helping them to become comfortable with learning how to iterate rapidly. We're helping them to build resilience, and we're helping them to understand that we're never going to know everything. And so in an environment where you don't know everything, do you know enough that you can get started and then learn quickly along the way? We learned all those things in the military routinely, and I think all of those things are applicable to what we're seeing in commercial settings as a result of what's transpired in COVID.
And you also mentioned now resilience. And this is the object of my research for some years. It was just timely.
Yeah, so if you look at the work of Angela Duckworth out of University of Pennsylvania on grit, and grit is highly correlated with leader success. Well, some folks have developed a high level of grit early on in their careers, and others are trying to build up to it over time. But we do know that the more gritty you are, the higher the likelihood that you'll do that which is necessary to achieve the full measure of your potential, whatever that potential is. And so it's not enough just for you to be gritty, but how do you build a gritty organization around you? That's the key.
Probably it's not the same for everybody, correct?
It is not. You have some folks that most certainly are geared towards becoming more resilient, and you have others that if they find themselves in a context and they think it's just too challenging, they don't respond effectively. It's kind of like the Yerkes-Dodson stress curve, where the increase in stress leads to an increase in performance, but it reaches a point where the stress continues building beyond that, performance actually starts to decline. And so leaders are always trying to get themselves and their organization to that optimal place on that stress curve so that they can perform at their absolute best. But you've got to build people's capacity for accepting that stress and use it in a productive way. And so the way in which you do it is by progressively exposing them to more and more challenging scenarios. Now, at this time, you had some folks that were just thrown into the fire really fast, and they hadn't had that opportunity to build up. And some folks responded well, and others, it was debilitating. That's why instead of just having this major cataclysmic event, it's better to start building it in a progressive and sequential way so that you're working up over time to where people can absorb more of that. It's just like training for a marathon, if you would. You don't start out by, I'm going to go for a 26-mile run today. Start out by going for a 2-mile run. You do that several days. Then you build up to, say, a 3-mile or 5-mile or a 10-mile, but you build up over time so that when it comes time to go do the 26-mile race, you've gone through a progressive and a sequential process to where you're prepared to do that. So some organizations that do a good job of providing their people lots of experiences that are adequately scoped were much better prepared than those that hadn't gone through a similar process. Their folk got thrown into the deep end and they just floundered.
Yes, and it seems like in the future, things are not going to be more simple, but probably even more complex. And when we think about what has happened in terms of poverty, climate change, inequality, and how these factors have affected especially some vulnerable groups, I would like to know from you, how do you perceive the world after COVID-19 in terms of inclusion?
Prior to COVID-19, there was already significant movement in different parts of the world to force organizations and governments to think more intently about how they were fostering inclusion, because the division between the haves and have-nots was becoming more exacerbated and was leading to greater conflict. COVID only exacerbated that reality. As a result, people are now asking, hey, is this the tipping point for organizations really changing how they go about fostering greater inclusion? And my response is always, it's too soon to say. It could be, but it doesn't automatically have to be. If we look at classic change theory asserts that the most difficult part of any change effort is actually establishing the need for change. So if an organization still gets access to enough good talent, the fact that it could have more doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change what it's doing. But if an organization starts to realize it can't accomplish its mission and it can't get access to the people it needs because it's not being inclusive enough, then they will open themselves up to the prospect of behaving differently. And so for some organizations, they might have hit that point. For others, maybe not. It kind of depends on where you're at in the world, what's the nature of the work you do, and a variety of other things. And so classic change theory calls that, creation of the realization that change is necessary, unfreezing. And so we're at a moment in time where we're starting to see, has the unfreeze occurred broadly for a lot of organizations as it pertains to changing how it creates or changing how they create inclusion within their ranks. The research indicates there's three primary ways in which unfreezing is done. Number one is induction of guilt or anxiety. Like you start to see, if we don't change, here's a raft of bad things that are going to happen, and that's not something we want to incur. Number two is what they call lack of confirmation or disconfirmation. We believe something's true and we can't prove it. We believe something's not true and we can't disprove it. Deep analytics can help with that. Number three is creation of psychological safety. You get a group of people who are highly trusted to say, we believe this is the right way to go. And because they have so much credibility, others say, if they're going, we're going. Certainly people have induced guilt or anxiety around this topic of inclusion. But once again, people will hold on to what they've got if they believe it's good enough. And so we're at an inflection point, if you would, as it talks about this topic. And if organizations start to see we are losing out in the war for talent, then they will probably start to think way harder about what's necessary to create a truly inclusive environment. And right now, we just don't know enough to assert with any clarity whether or not we've reached that point. Does that make sense?
Yes, because actually the past week we had this panel at IPADE in which an interdisciplinary group of professors, we discussed the post-pandemic world. What do we see? And the topic that I brought to the table was related to the war for talent. And as you are saying, even before the pandemic, there were many talent shortages because we didn't have, well, I'm referring to Mexico, of course, the necessary skills in the talent available for organizations to cover their needs. So Manpower was saying before the pandemic that 50% of the positions were not being able to be covered or to be, and the problem is, and I want to know your point of view on this and also what's happening in other regions in the world, because apparently the upskilling and reskilling that has been required during the pandemic and in the future as well, because this change it doesn't stop here. It will continue to have this evolution. So what do you see in terms of the war for talent, this talent shortage, and what may be needed in the future?
Well, with respect to the talent shortage, it's going to have to be greater access to education and training by societies, not just by companies. Societies are going to have to relook their models for how they provide people the skills so that they can compete successfully in organizational life. For companies, they're going to have to think far more broadly about where they go look for their talent, as opposed to just maybe narrowly going to the same places they've always gone in the past. And so it's always great when you look for somebody who says, I have specific domain, specific expertise, that, it's an easy fit. It's another thing to say, is this person someone we can grow into a great person inside our organization? But they kind of look non-traditional right now. They're going to have to open the aperture for what they're looking for and determine things to a far greater extent on potential as opposed to simply past performance.
IPADE. The world calls.